Welcome back to For the Record. I'm your host, Justin Allen Rose, and this episode features a conversation I had with Representative Daniel Pae. Daniel is a representative for Oklahoma's House District 62, which covers a good chunk of Lawton on the west side. We mainly talked about House Bill 2109, which he authored that is supposed to protect tenants from retaliation from their landlords. We also spoke about his yay vote regarding the parental choice tax credit, as well as whether he'd support term limits for our federal legislator. This is For the Record. Daniel, thank you for joining me for this third episode of the podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, just trying to stay warm out there. It's a little topsy-turvy weather.
It is. It's a little chilly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so let's go ahead and get started. So this podcast, of course, is going to center around the bill that you authored last year in 2023. It was House Bill 2109. And so to start out, can you tell me basically a quick summarization of this bill for the listeners?
So House Bill 2109 deals with the Landlord-Tenant Act, and so that was passed back in the 70s, and had a colleague from the Tulsa Metro, former Representative Carol Bush, who passed legislation on amending the deductible repair amount. Before it was $100, which because of inflation and other factors, it doesn't mean a lot when it comes to making those necessary repairs in a rental property. So it was modified to either 1 month's rent or something to that effect to make it more up to par with today's economy. So that was the first time the act had been amended since the 70s. And so she decided to not run for re-election. And she told me about, as far as the next phase of modernizing the Landlord-Tenant Act, it was about anti-retaliation. And now 44 other states have this type of law on their books. The premise is simply that if a tenant has anything health or safety related that they need to report in their unit, they should do so and get that fixed without any fear of being retaliated against. Again, that was something that 44 other states, the vast majority of the country, has already implemented and passed, and it seemed like a common sense idea to move forward with as far as trying to make sure the act is updated and modernized.
Of course. So the bill was introduced in 2023 in the House. It passed the House, and then went to the Senate. It stalled a little bit. It's still, I'm assuming, still in the Senate. Can you speak to where the bill is currently at and the path that it needs to take to maybe become law in the future?
Yeah, we passed the bill through the House. It passed Senate committee, and so now it can be heard by the entire Senate. Now, the Senate author was former Senator John Montgomery. He's doing a great job at the Law Enforcement Chamber of Commerce right now. At the same time, I will need to find a new Senate author, and so that's on my to-do list the next few weeks as we get back for regular session. But once we identify a new Senate author, they will take it through the full Senate, and there were some adjustments made to the language that will come back to the House one more time before that.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it needs a Senate author to get it to push through.
Correct.
If it doesn't have an author, it just dies out pretty much.
Correct. And that's typical with the process. If you want to get a bill to the other chamber, you need to find a partner, in this case a Senate author, and it's the same case for Senate bills. This is unique in that we'll have to find a new author when we're already halfway through the process, but definitely want to find someone who is passionate about this issue, who has knowledge firsthand about landlords and renters. And I think that those are the key ingredients to make sure this bill gets passed.
Before we get further into, let's say, the language of the bill, is it typical, you mentioned how you worked with John Michael Montgomery to get this bill passed. He was in the Senate, you're of course in the House. Is it typical for representatives that are located within really closely geographical to work together to get certain bills passed in the Oklahoma legislature?
When it comes to finding the ideal author, it just depends. Certainly John and I had a very close working relationship, so we authored many bills together. It can also be if you share the same passion and have the same motivation for advocating any given issue. It just really depends, but overall it's good to have a partner you can work with and someone who's knowledgeable and passionate about that given issue, and that'll help ensure it's a smoother process in the end.
Getting back to the bill, was it you that wrote the actual language of the bill, or was it a concerted effort by you and John Michael Montgomery?
So I initially filed the bill on the House side and asked John to sign on as Senate author. And since we've adjourned from session last year, I do appreciate the coverage from KSW. I know there was a situation in Lawton that dealt with what exactly were we trying to address with this bill, namely that in the summer where it was quite the opposite from what it was right now, like super high temperatures, very hot temperatures, and there was a complex where the AC was not properly functioning and not being addressed accordingly. I do want to emphasize that the bill applies to those who own 10 or more rental units. So we have noticed the past several years that there are a lot of out-of-state companies and landlords who purchase property and purchase these rental units. That's one example. So we want to hold them accountable. And I do believe that the vast majority of landlords in this state are doing their job, are properly taking care of their units. But I want to make sure that's consistent across the board, hence the necessity of this bill.
And perfect segue to the part of the bill that I really want to ask you about was the qualifier, the 10 unit that the landlord has to be renting out 10 different properties. Why did you feel it was necessary to add that in? Because if you look at, I know it's not in Lawton, but if you look at the Fredericks, the Chattanoogas, the Indianapolis, I know a lot of landlords that maybe have 2 to 3 houses they're renting out. Shouldn't the people who are renting for them have the same sort of rights against retaliatory measures from those individuals as the renters who are renting from, let's say, landlords who have 10 or more properties?
Yeah, no, I think the vast majority of those landlords who own 10 or fewer units are doing their jobs properly, taking good care of their renters. And I would submit they have even more personal relationship because it is a fewer number of units that they have to address versus an out-of-state landlord who may or may not show up to the property if there is an issue, and it can be difficult to get a hold of them directly versus a landlord who owns 10 or fewer property units. You can just easily find out where they are and how to contact them. And I think with the bill as written and as amended, we made sure to strike a good balance between landlords and tenants in terms of the situations that we're covering, where the standard is health and safety. If those are directly affected when it comes to the tenant's perspective, that's what we want to make sure gets addressed. At the same time, we don't want to overtly punish landlords and restrict their ability to do their jobs. So we work with stakeholders from both perspectives to make sure the language is balanced, that was done in a fair manner, and that was consistent with how the law already exists in 44 other states.
Do you worry at all about, let's say this bill passes, I know the news has its job to get the word out, of course, but do you worry that a lot of people who are renting from those types of landlords simply won't know this bill exists, or this new law exists, or maybe they don't even have enough money to get an attorney, to get a lawyer in order to pursue legal action against a landlord who doesn't follow this new law if it does become a law?
Yeah, and knock on wood that it does become law. And I think the word will quickly spread through outlets like yourself and other platforms, because this is a pretty significant accomplishment in that we are catching up with the rest of the country. And we'll make sure to work with relevant organizations. For example, the Oklahoma Association of Realtors has been supportive of this legislation. So it's logical that they'll help get the word out through their membership. Among other organizations. So it'll be a team effort. And that's the challenge with any bill. Once you get it passed, it's all about the implementation phase. And that takes a lot of people working together, a lot of groups working together. But I believe we can get it done.
And so the bill would allow the landlord to retain the right to recovery, meaning take back control of the property, if it was done in good faith. Within the bill, there are a few things listed that you determine to be in good faith, or the bill, let's say, determines to be in good faith. One of those states that it is good faith as long as the landlord is recovering possession of the unit from the tenant in order to use it as a primary residence for either the landlord or the landlord's immediate family. Can you clarify that for me, what that means a little bit? Because when I read that, I could be totally off base. I worry that, let's say, a landlord says, well, my family members, or even if it's a more retaliatory measure, this person complained about whatever it is, so, well, my sister wants this property now. And then a month later, the sister moves on and they rent it out to a new tenant, let's say. Is that a worry within yourself, putting that within the bill?
Well, and that's what we thought carefully about, how we worded that section, as well as all the others related to landlords, to make sure that everything is done in good faith, that you have the legal process do its job when it comes to verifying what's factual and what's not. So there'll be mechanisms in place so that you can prove or disprove any of these claims. And again, we want to make sure it's fair to both landlords and tenants, that each side has their due process, if you will, and that their consideration is heard, their voice is heard in court if it gets to that point. So that's kind of how that was worded in that section, to make sure that we account for all those factors.
Was there any, I don't want to say pressure, let's say, but what kind of role did interest or advocacy groups played in the formation of this bill? Because there's always that kind of idea of, at least those, let's say, within political science, of advocacy groups have a large influence on the language of the bill. Did this bill see the same thing?
Well, as far as the language, it came mainly based on what we saw from other states in terms of the best practices that we could determine. In terms of the advocacy for this bill, I am grateful that we had a number of organizations. I mentioned the Oklahoma Association of Realtors, we have the Mental Health Association of Oklahoma, Housing Solutions from the Tulsa area. All these groups coming together help get the word out to members in the House and the Senate about the importance of this legislation. So advocacy has a huge role to play when it comes to the legislative process. I can't do everything on my own. There are 148 other colleagues I have to convince to vote for the bill, and so it takes a team effort. And I'm grateful for everyone who stepped up the past session and who are still on board to get this through across the finish line this upcoming session. But yeah, you can't do it by yourself in any situation. You got to make sure you have a good coalition of support, and that's what we had here with this bill.
If it doesn't pass the Senate this time around, so this is the second session of the 59th legislature, correct?
Yes.
If it doesn't pass this time around in the Senate, it goes away. It's killed, correct?
We would have to start over in 2025. So as you mentioned before, we're almost, if not past the halfway point when it comes to this particular bill. So if it doesn't get all the way through to the governor's desk by the end of May, then that's correct. We would have to start from the very beginning. But I would submit that we have a good foundation if we go down that road. But my objective is to get this heard and considered and passed by May.
Of course. If it does, knock on wood, hopefully, let's say, doesn't pass, you would be introducing it again. That's on your plate. You would introduce it again in 2025, you think?
We came we've gotten very close this session. The support is there. I believe the language is optimal for all involved parties. So yeah, I want to make sure we get this done.
You don't think in the future maybe you will add, or maybe we see in the future, well, let's talk about the other states real quick. Does other states qualify it just like this bill does in terms of the tenant unit? Do they usually do the same thing? Some
states do, and so yeah, the language was incorporated based on what we gathered from other states. That's worked well. I should know that this is not the end as far as the journey of modernizing the Landlord-Tenant Act. Again, this is the second major effort to try to get this act up to par in the 21st century. I think there are many more ideas we have to consider, and this should be tied into the larger issue of affordable housing, which we've seen tremendous attention here in Oklahoma, and hopefully we'll address that issue as well this session. But there's still more work to be done, and other states are being creative and innovative in their approach. I think that's the beauty of our country, is that you have the laboratories of democracy with all 50 states. So I look forward to learning even more about what's been happening since this bill was first considered and is introduced last year.
A lot of what I'm hearing mentions or screams to me kind of incremental changes. I know a lot of people, including in my generation, and probably your generation too.
I think we're both millennials, right?
I think, yeah, how old are you?
28.
I'm older than you. I'm turning 30 this year.
You're still a millennial, yeah.
So I'm on the back end of it. But we kind of want things quick. We want things now.
Right.
We have it on our phones, what have you. And maybe some see that qualifier, the 10 unit qualifier, and think, no, we need it now just across the board. It's just something to speak of towards that incremental changes, how we can't have everything. Right now we have to have stepping stones in order to reach the point where we eventually want to get, because we try to go through everything right now, we're just going to get hit with a brick wall to an extent.
Change takes time. That's what the founders intended for our system of government. Like I mentioned to you last week, it's very hard to get a bill passed, and I think it should be. You don't want a bad idea just to go through the process without any accountability or vetting. There has to be questioning, and in some cases there has to be debate on the pros and the cons of any given policy idea. So that's what makes it fun. That's what makes it challenging. But it's all of our jobs as representatives, as senators, in our respective roles to make sure that we do our homework, that we carefully consider the implications and long-term impact of policies such as this. And it does have direct impact on people's lives. That's why it's so important. Another example I'll give you is that with the Casey Alert Act, that took well over 4 years. We started that pre-COVID initially, and so that took a while to convince colleagues and to get through the process. But I'm pretty persistent, and I don't like to give up, so I'll keep fighting the good fight.
So let's transition now. I want to talk about a bill that did pass last cycle. It was signed into law by Governor Stitt. That's House Bill 1934. That's a parental choice school bill. You voted yea on it. There has been a lot of, I would say in the media and from more of the left-wing organizations, a little bit of pushback against that bill. One quote, I want to read you 3 quotes, and then I just want to get your response to those quotes. 2 come from parents that we had from a story, and 1 comes from a superintendent within the LPS school system. One quote from one worried parent said, "As a parent, I feel like my child's education would suffer because my tax dollars would be going to parents whose children are in private school or homeschooling instead of where my children go to school at." Another parent said, "On the surface, it sounds really good, but school choice in this instance means that we're going to carve out about 5% of Oklahoma families who attend private schools and basically put more in their pockets." And then that superintendent said, "Although it's a tax credit, the impact won't be as much, but the fear is still that if we take out a general revenue, we're going to see about 30, they get about 36% of the public schools get about 36% of the funding through that general revenue." Are those fears, I don't want to say not correct, but what could you say towards those fears that maybe will calm them, or maybe those fears are head on?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. So I would say, number one, this is not a school voucher or what's commonly referred to as a educational savings account, ESA, proposal. Those ideas would take money directly from the funding formula into private schools. And those would have a detrimental effect to the quality of our public education. Some states have gone in that direction, and we chose not to go that way. And it's no secret that this governor, the superintendent of education, campaigned on this issue, and they won their elections resoundingly in 2022. So a year ago, we anticipated that they would be advocating for this issue, and the Senate had already attempted to try to pass this the year before. So the question was, how do we move forward in a way that protects public education and doesn't damage the institutions there? And so what came about was this compromise proposal with this tax credit. I do want to emphasize that it's up to each individual parent to choose whether or not to take advantage of this. There's no mandate, there's no requirement that parents have to use this tax credit. I do believe that it is up to each parent to decide what the best education looks like, whether it is public school, private school, or even homeschool. How they so choose to educate their child, that's on them. What I did like about the way that this bill was written, and if you read it specifically, there are layers of accountability. So it's not just we give the money away and there's no strings attached, there's no way to determine where the money is going. So parents who use this tax credit, they have to show the receipts essentially. They have to demonstrate how they're using the money to buy what supplies and what have you through the tax commission. They have the system set up there. Additionally, if there's a revenue failure, this tax credit is suspended. I know that was a concern that many folks had, is that if you have this alternative credit out there, how's it going to affect public education whenever we have a recession or economic downturn and we have to cut services? No one wants to be in that situation, but we have to hope for the best and plan for the worst. So if that were to come about, how would you address it? And I believe this bill does that in a thoughtful way. And the proponents of this type of idea have always said it's meant to help those from the lower income bracket. And the way that this tax credit is structured, it is means tested. So it's $5,000 to $7,500 as far as the range that you could qualify for. And so if you come from a low income bracket, you would get more of the tax credit. So that in and of itself does achieve that objective. And so I get it from a general viewpoint that you can be skeptical and you can be reluctant to support it on its face. But when it comes to governing, as we just talked about a few minutes ago, there's a lot of ups and downs, there's a lot of ins and outs you got to get through to the final product. So when it comes to how this was formulated and drafted, I think there were many ways to hold it accountable to the taxpayers as a whole and to us as policymakers, because there are other alternatives out there that go in a much more aggressive direction. And so this does help many families all throughout Oklahoma, regardless of your zip code or what type of situation you're in. So I think it was thoughtful and it's nuanced. It's not this or that. Like, there are many intricacies in the bill itself if you read it thoroughly. And so I think that's where many of us felt it's not perfect by any means. There's always room for improvement. But we had to address this issue head on during the session. And I think this, coupled with the increases we had in public education funding, $500 million toward the funding formula directly, $125 million more toward the Redbud Fund, investments in maternity leave and school safety. All this is a complete package. And that's the other thing about the bill itself, is that it has a severability clause, meaning that the two are connected. So you could just vote for the public education side, not the tax credit, but they are connected if you read the bill. So I know back in 2018 you had some folks who voted for the teacher pay raise itself, but voted against the revenue package. The revenue package is what paid for the teacher pay raise. So you can't. So that's a little disingenuous to say that you support a teacher pay raise, but you didn't support how it was actually funded. So same case in this, very similar in that they were both connected as worded. So all that to say, when it comes to this issue, there are a lot of nuances that were considered. And so I think at the end of the day, the fact that it was a win for public education in terms of increased funding. I also should mention there was another teacher pay raise depending on years of experience in the final package. But it was very comprehensive in how it was formulated. And so there's always reasons to dislike any given bill. But overall, you got to figure out, does this help holistically when it comes to the education system as a whole? So hopefully somewhere I answered your question.
Oh, no, 100%
Yeah.
you did. I appreciate your answer. It kind of raises another question for me too. Going through kind of political science, there's different types of representation that somebody like yourself can act upon. There's the trustee model, delegate model, political model. How do you balance out what you might think is the correct course of action for the state and for your constituents versus maybe what your constituents want? Maybe they want something different from what you think is the correct course of action. How do you balance those two?
I think that's a good question in terms of what type of leader you want to be. I've learned the past 6 years, you're not going to make everyone happy. Nor should you try, because that's never going to be an achievable objective. There's always going to be someone who wishes things were done differently or that disagree with how you decide on a certain vote. But I think at the end of the day, so long as you're accessible and approachable to people, that's what matters in the end. I don't think any elected official's chances for re-election or continuing on with the job depend on one or two different votes. It's about, does he or she connect with their constituents? If they see them at Walmart or at the gym, are they able to have a good conversation with them? And I believe I have. So when it comes to what you referenced on military issues, on veterans issues, absolutely, I will fight hard for those things because Lawton is a military community. But when it comes to education or mental health or economic development, you saw that with the ARPA process. We had to think about how does this benefit the whole state of Oklahoma long term. You have to make those decisions as well. So it's all connected, but at the end of the day, you got to make sure you're grounded in where you came from, where you were born and raised. In my case, that's Lawton, and make sure that you preserve that connection with folks, no matter what happens or whatever decision you make on any given bill. And that's been my model, and I think it has been successful in that I've always been, to the best of my ability, responsive. The folks who reach out to the office and personally call or email them back. So when it comes to being a trustee or a delegate, I think there's a balance. You got to make sure you take care of your people, of course, but you got to make sure you think about the big picture as well.
You mentioned re-election. You have an election year coming up this year. How do you talk about balancing delegate versus, let's say, trustee? How do you balance re-election campaigning versus governing?
Well, in my view, you should focus on the job at hand. So the next several months, we're going to be in session. So that's my primary focus, is getting these bills considered and ultimately passed. We'll have plenty of time as far as the campaign ahead. So I'm focused right now on doing the job that I've been elected to, and then I'm excited to get to tell my story later on in the year as far as what's been happening the past 6 years in this position. And I mentioned this to a friend the other day, as far as, now 6 years in, I've gained more trust, more respect from colleagues, and I think overall more experience being in this role. And I'm sure you're well aware we have term limits in Oklahoma, so the fact that I'm 6 years in, as well as a number of our delegation members are 6+ years in, we're at a time where we can optimize and maximize our seniority. I think that's exciting for Southwest Oklahoma, and so I'm looking forward to seeing where we go from here.
I'm really glad you mentioned term limits, because this is going to be the last question, and I asked this question because it is my, I want to say pet project, but it's something that I feel strongly about. If you win in November, you have 2 years and then another 2 years. You'll be term limited out in 2030, correct?
Well, so that'd be 6 more years altogether from.
Yes, from here, yes, yeah. So at 2030, you'll be term limited out, correct? Okay, so my math is correct on math. There has been a shift in recent years, especially in terms, Dusty Devers just won an election in December. He he signed I don't know if it's a memo or what you want to call it, saying, I will support term limits for the federal legislature. Let's say if an amendment vote does come up amongst the 50 states. However, I know you went to public policy school at OU, master's, kind of through the political science program, as I did over at University of Tennessee. And have you read the literature on term limits?
In general, I'm familiar.
And
so being in Oklahoma and what it's like in the system.
One of the studies, and the many studies, pretty much noted that term limits, or at least within these studies, show that term limits tend to be a detriment to governance. One of those things mentioned, we characterize the biggest impact on behavior and priorities as a Burkean shift, whereby term-limited legislators become less beholden to the constituents in their geographical districts and more attentive to other concerns. The reform also increases the power of the executive branch, meaning the governors, bureaucracies in terms of the state level, over those legislative outcomes, and weakens the influence of majority party leaders and those committee chairs. Do you support term limits? And if you do, why do you think those studies have it wrong, especially since you have firsthand experience, let's say, operating in a term-limited state?
Yeah, well, first of all, the citizens of Oklahoma spoke on this a couple of decades ago now. I don't see that changing. I think we'll continue to have term limits here of 12 years. I do agree that what's happened, especially the past 10 years, a lot of the power, a lot of the influence, a lot of the institutional knowledge has been consolidated toward state agencies and then lobbyists. So it is kind of a catch-22 with many people who support term limits, in that you want to give more power back to the people and decentralize government. But what's happened is kind of the opposite, and that a lot of the bureaucrats who are unelected, they're the ones who have quite a bit of power in this system. And that's what we've all had to navigate. In 2018, there was tremendous turnover because of term limits and other factors, in that we were the largest freshman class, 47 Republicans and Democrats. And I would actually say that it's been overall more productive, more collaborative since then in terms of how we function as government. So I do believe in healthy turnover and making sure you change leadership when the time comes. You never want to outstay your welcome, and you should go out on your own terms. I do believe that. And I think there is a reason, if you look at the overall history, even though we have a 12-year term limit, for most people it's 6 or 8 years. That is the natural term limit because of family, because of other opportunities to serve, what have you, but that's been the case. So as far as whether or not should we change the current term limit, I don't see that being realistic.
What about federal level? If an amendment somehow, I don't think it would come about, but let's say amendment votes on, federal-wise, go kicks to the states, they have a ratifying convention or whatever you want to call it, would you be one of the ones? Of course you have to read the term limits, how long the term limits to be, there's going to be a lot of qualifiers, but overall, would you be interested in that sort of thing?
Well, overall, I think the election should be the term limit, meaning that if you don't agree or like your representative or senator, you have the chance to vote for someone else, or to run yourself as a candidate. That's the beauty of our country. So that's what I would say when it comes to a federal term limit, is that make sure you look at what's happened in Oklahoma, where there were good intentions to pass this initiative, but what's happened is power and knowledge has been directed toward agencies and lobbyists. And there are situations where if an agency or lobbyist doesn't like a certain member, they just got to wait 12 years for the next person to take office. So it's a double-edged sword. But at the end of the day, I believe that elections should be the term limits, that if your elected officials doing a good job, they'll keep getting reelected. If they are not doing a good job, then there are electoral consequences. But that's why it's so important that we all get involved and we all stay engaged. Not just federally, but some of these local elections like city council and school board. Those are critical as far as the services that we get to people and what happens directly in each of our lives.
Well, Representative Pae, thank you.
Of course, Justin. My pleasure.
It's been a good one.
Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed the conversation and learned a bit more about one of your representatives in our government as a whole. If you would like to see someone in particular on the show, don't be afraid to reach out to me at justin.rose@kswo.com. See you back here in 2 weeks' time. I'm Justin Allen Rose, and this has been For the Record.